Anybody in here really into nativity sets? Yeah, some of y'all, several of y'all. Nativity sets, some of them have gotten a little bit more distinct, but a lot of nativity sets, the whole point of a nativity set, some people don't like them because it doesn't, like they're not ever always there at once, but the point of a nativity set is to put everyone who's in the Christmas story into one picture to show and carry the entire weight of glory of what happened. It's supposed to put everything in one picture so that you get just how big of a moment this is. That's what nativity set's for. Now, the characters are intentionally diverse in the nativity story, right? First of all, you've got Mary and the baby in center stage. They're always there. But then you've got animals that intentionally set the cast, the context of the place, right? They set and let you know they're in a poor manger, they're in this kind of place. Then usually you have the Magi, usually 3 because we sing, and they usually dress like kings for some reason because we sing the We Three Kings of Orient are. It's just Magi, but we usually generally have 3 of them there that kind of tell you the rich and the wise came. Then there's shepherds, right? And they'll tell you that the angels came and they told the poor people. You got the wise shepherds and wealthy possibly, and you've got shepherds that are poor, and you got this really diverse group of things. And then you've got some other characters and usually a few other things, and they all pretty much look alike. And every year there was a nativity set I used to see, and I'd go, I don't know which one of these. I think they just randomly take one of the other diverse characters and make it Joseph. It's a male figure. You just pick one of the other random male figures, and maybe they have the exact right amount, so you know. But he's just kind of this real generic-looking person. And I thought, if he was if he kind of knew Rodney Dangerfield, he'd be repeating his stuff. I don't get no respect. He doesn't get a lot of notice. Nobody cares about Joseph very much because he is ultra silent in the Bible. He has several stories about him, but he is not quoted one time. He's totally silent. Not a word does he speak. The Lord speaks to him, and he acts. And it's as simple as that. The poor guy. I always thought he must have felt incredibly disrespected back in that moment, right? He had to have felt disrespected. Can you imagine your betrothed coming over to your house, coming home, and saying, okay, I've got some good news and I got some bad news. The bad news is I'm pregnant. The good news is God did it. God did it. Right. No, really, sure, God really did it. Sure, God did it. What happened? Well, Gabriel came into my room. Well, stop right there. Who is this guy Gabe who came into your room? I want to talk to him. No. The angel Gabriel came into my room and told me that I'm going to have the Messiah as a virgin and be the mother of the Son of God. He doesn't buy it. Because he's going to divorce her. He's going to send her off. He doesn't buy it. But you can imagine his life is crumbling. His heart is falling out from under him. And in that culture, especially, very disrespected. How would we handle that? It's hard to even imagine now a person dealing with a more severe devastation. That the one that you were supposed to spend your life with, the one that you've given yourself to, has given themselves over to another. It's probably equal, if not more devastating than what most of us have ever had to deal with in our lives. And before God even speaks a word of verification in the dreams of Joseph, Joseph balances 2 important attributes for changing the world that I think God knows is in him and is a part of him, and he demonstrates toward Mary before he's ever told a thing. God seems to have waited. You see, God could have come to him at the same night or the same day he told Mary. But he waits for them to have this conversation and see, I think he's kind of seeing how Joseph is going to react and respond. And here's what it said in verse 19. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, planned to send her away secretly. God calls us to loving righteousness, just like Joseph is demonstrating here. This is who he's looking when he's calling. When he says, who am I going to send? Who do I need? He goes, I need somebody loving and righteous to be the father of my son. Joseph could have shamed her publicly. He could have ridiculed her and mocked her, given her up, chased her off, or even be stoned. He could have even kept the fairly large dowry he would have been given. But by sending her away, he has to pay back the dowry that he's given her. He's probably got to take on a certain amount of shame himself. And guess what? That's probably what all his friends would have been encouraging him to do. You know what? You really need to protect yourself. You really need to make sure your family is not going to be shamed because of all of this. And he's saying, look, I'm going to handle this with integrity. I'm going to handle this with the kind of righteousness that God has shown Israel, and I hope he shows me. You know, one of the things we might say today is, well, why didn't he just let it go, forgive her, and marry her? That seems more loving. Well, that would be to break the other part of righteousness. There's righteousness and loving righteousness. The righteousness is this balance that we're going to talk about. Right? If she had been with another man, he by law could not marry her. Otherwise, he would be committing adultery with her, because by being with the other man, he's technically married her. And the law says you can't go marrying somebody who's done that. Does that make sense? She would have to go through this full divorce with whoever. So in his mind, he's not buying the God did it thing. And you can't blame him I don't blame him for this. I doubt Mary blamed him for this. Pretty tough situation. See, love isn't some bland approval that everything goes. But his righteousness, again, will not cast her out with the wolves either. He's not so righteous in this sense of legalistic that he goes, I'm so righteous, I can't do anything but destroy people who do something evil. He's loving and he's righteous. He was willing to lose for her. You see that? He's willing to lose face. He's willing to lose money, even though she's probably done him the most devastating pain that he could probably imagine. That's what he's thinking anyway. He will lose, again, all the kind of honor and family and hope that he had. Now, what I want to say is that this shows us that was his right to do all that. This shows us a deep gap between rights and righteousness. There is a big gap between rights and righteousness. Do you see this in this story? He had the right to do all these things to her. But righteousness, this loving righteousness, doesn't take that course. See, we can have a pretty visceral rejection and desire for revenge when somebody hurts us, right? When somebody does something wrong to us, our first reaction is, well, I'm going to do back to you the same thing you've done back to me, if not worse. And the wisdom of our age is definitely protect yourself. Even if it's your spouse who's done you wrong. You know, I've seen sad tales of people going through divorces full of betrayals and manipulations and abandonment. I've seen former spouses demolish the ones that they claim to have loved. I've seen business partners, especially in my younger years, business partners let greed turn into competition, which turned into a contest to bankrupt the other. You know, the more relationships are pressed and in conflict and in trials, the more urge we feel to press our rights rather than righteousness. We feel a deep urge of having the sense of justice, even to score an eye for an eye, like the Old Testament says. Now, here's the difference. I want to kind of expand a little bit on what's the difference. Law and rights are the minimum way that we should treat each other. They're the boundaries. That's the worst you should treat someone. This is according, if I'm saying I want my rights, that initially, a long time ago, used to mean that's the minimum way that you're allowed to treat me. This has kind of changed over the years, right? Now they're kind of an imperative for everyone to agree and recognize everything about me as valid. I want to be recognized. My right is to be totally validated and for everybody to agree with me, or you're destroying my rights. We're trying to make rights into righteousness. That's what people want to do because they don't believe in God, so there is no exact understanding of righteousness. But we all know there's more. There's got to be more to relationships than living on the boundaries of relationships. And so we're trying to create a secular righteousness with one another, and it's destroying the fabric of our country and of our civilization. You know, I go so far as to say that people today now believe the way to improve the world is through the proper accumulation of rights, not through the righteousness of Jesus Christ and of God Himself as a way to treat one another. I mean, I like rights. Don't get me wrong. Rights in their right place are a proper thing, a right thing to have, right? Lots of rights. But God uses righteousness based on His character and His love to change the world and nothing else. That's Him. Righteousness is Him. Try to live just by rights at home. See how that goes, right? I can tell you, it ain't going to go well. That's the kind of person, I've seen spouses like this, who try to figure out how much they can get away with. Just living on that edge. And that becomes one really toxic marriage. And so as Americans, as people in our Western culture, and as people in churches, and as people in families who are so concerned about making sure everyone is worried about my rights, we're going to be living in an increasingly toxic environment. Because we can't trust each other. There's no actual concern. I'm just concerned that you're treating me well. And that's it. But God calls us to His righteousness. That's the righteousness Joseph is practicing here. He calls us to real love, not some anarchic tolerance of anything goes world either. He's not saying, look, love is just this thing where nothing matters and there's no rules. That you see that people are going, man, why do there got to be so many rules? Well, righteousness has rules, but it has love too. And it's this balance that Joseph is holding up. He's saying, look, I'm not going to break God's rules and God's law on one hand. I can't move forward that direction. But I love like God loves a broken and sinful people. And I'm also not going to destroy her either. And so he, in this sense, is acting like Christ. You know, churches, conservatives, liberals, Americans are so hell-bent in getting the minimum out of everyone else around them, they find themselves unable to practice righteousness to anyone. It's a sad sort of place that we're in. Now, hear this. Because sometimes when you read this story, you're like, oh, God rescues you when you're just acting righteous, you know. I don't mean to say that. People, you're going to go through real tragedies and hurts that God's not going to come down and be like, oh, by the way, I'm glad you acted really righteous. None of that really happened and your marriage can go back to normal. You see that? Joseph, he's righteous and all of a sudden, boom, a light bulb turns on as he gets a dream and his life goes back, well, somewhat like he might have expected, probably not anything like he expected once he knows it. But that dream puts his marriage back together. Some of you are going to deal with real tragedies in life where somebody does something to you that hurts terribly. And there's not going to be an instant remedy in a dream or any other way because people really do cheat. They really do betray, they sue each other, and they destroy people, even when you're acting righteously. But that's the real test here. As we find out later, Jesus does justify the righteous. He does it in His time, in His way, after the Lord justifies Him in resurrection from the dead, and He sheds us and justifies us. We'll talk about that here in a minute, because He's called to take the sins of the world. But God changes this world by calling upon us to be righteous in the middle of an unjust and a rights-based world. In other words, we can do better than living by our rights. We can live by the righteousness of Jesus Christ Himself, of both holding up law and His ways and rules and the way He calls us to live, of how to treat one another, and also by just absolutely loving other people. That's what He's calling us to, and it's not an easy place to, it's a lot easier to say, okay, well, I'm not going to care what anybody says about it. I'm just going to love people and not have any grounds and rules. Or to be a super strict, angry, person who goes, somebody hurt me, I'm going to smash them. We like, generally, most of us go one direction or the other. When we're in traffic, I mostly want to, right? You mostly are just angry and you just want to get back, right? But when it's your family or when it's kids or when it's something else, you just go, people go, well, you really don't need to have any rules. You just need to love people and not pay attention to anything they do. You're called, I'm called, we're called, the church is called to hold both of these up. And we might disagree on exactly how that works at times, but to hold these two together. So God calls us and uses us for His kingdom. Are you doubtful God's Messiah can come in the middle of your attempt to be righteous? Can He come and change your story in the midst of your tragedy? Even if that tragedy is ongoing. That's what He does right here. And I was thinking through this. I talk about story quite a bit, and it's very intentional. Because basically, when you're watching the news, they're always trying to set a narrative, right? They're always trying to, I'm using some of the same terminology so that we understand this thing. Whose story are you living in? Because the media has a story they want you to live in. You've got your own stories that you've told yourself you need to live in. Maybe some of you have parents who told you exactly how your life needs to go, and you're kind of living in their story. There's all kinds of people pressing in to say, this is the story of your life. If you're coming out of high school, that's one of the hardest times to figure out what's going to be my life story. Whose story are you living in? You know, it was always difficult for people to believe the Messiah would come from such humble, strange, weird beginnings and end with an even more shameful death. That was a hard story to buy. Do you get that? The story of Jesus Christ as the Savior, that was not an easy story to live in, because everyone else was telling the story that the Messiah was going to come and kick Rome's tail and leave them running. But God came, and Jesus, and He said, this the Christmas story is, no. This is my story. My Son's going to come to this virgin in Israel with these very humble beginnings, and I'm going to start in a manger, and this is my story, not your story. And you can't get into righteousness. You can't understand what God's doing. You can't accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior until you decide whose story you're really going to live in. Matthew wrote this book, I think it seems partly in the way he did, to demonstrate that Jesus really was the Messiah. And so he spends a great deal of time demonstrating how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament story, prophecies and all. He's wanting to present us with a light bulb moment, you might say, where we go, of course, I see now. God was always going to do it that way. That's why he starts off with the genealogy, and you see this nice flow that he's going to be a part of. He's part of this kingly, Davidic, Abrahamic, all those are in there. You go, okay, that part is satisfied. But then when you get to Joseph, he says this, he's quoting Isaiah 7:14 there in Matthew 1:23. It says, he's quoting him, he says, Isaiah said, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means, or is translated as, God with us. And I stopped to think about this for a while, and I said, who better for Matthew to choose to represent the most ultimate doubter than Joseph? I mean, think about that. You know, you didn't do to Mary. You're not the one who got Mary pregnant. You know, this is a tough situation. You're emotionally distraught at this point, right? I mean, he's not just doubting intellectually that Mary's telling the truth. He is experiencing an entire crushing moment. Who better to come and say, Joseph, this is real, and here's your aha moment. And if Joseph can have an aha moment where he comes out of doubt and into belief, who are we not to do the same? We never had nearly as much invested in Mary. We never had invested in this life of this small town Nazarene girl. But he did, and he changed his mind. He went through something, and now we know what it is. Matthew records what it is that changed a man from who should have been ultimately destroyed, distraught, shamed, into being honored and known and faithful and righteous. Do you see that? He's sort of the ultimate presentation that we should believe. Now we discover here in Joseph, I discover something interesting. I was talking about it to my daughter last night, and she liked talking about it. We talked about it forever. We discover here that true stories can have false meanings. What I mean by that is the story you think is true. We can tell ourselves, we can say, okay, here's a true story, and you can miss the meaning. T.S. Eliot says exactly that. He goes, you can have the experience and miss the meaning. In other words, there's some variable that sometimes we think we know we know a true story. We know the true story that she's pregnant and he didn't do it. Right? That's a true story. He's missing a very important variable to making the meaning right. What is that meaning? God intervened truly in Joseph. You know, sort of, problem for most of us is that the problem he was really having was he had not yet decided and understood he was living in God's story fully. He thought he was an outside character, just a regular Jewish kid. And he had not fully understood this very important part that makes our story go from my story to it's his story. That's the variable. That's where you go from, I don't understand meaning in my life. I know this has happened in my life. I know that's happened in my life. I know these things have happened in my life, but I don't understand why they're happening in my life. Maybe I'm just this way. Maybe this is just, have bad luck. Maybe I'm a poor chooser, like Joseph might have said, of a spouse. You can come up with all kinds of narratives about yourself. But the key thing most people miss is that God is coming into their story. That's not what's happening here. We are entering his story. Now, he comes into our lives. He comes to here on earth. But earth was always his. The whole cosmos has always been his. We rebelled. We left his story. And when you enter back in, you say, I want to be a part of your story, Lord. You're inviting me back into your story. Your life, the tragedies you've gone through, the joys you have gone through, come back and they start to have real meaning again. They start to be complete. Understanding can come. You know, I think what's amazing here is Joseph's response. It's kind of amazing to me he believed it like that from a dream. Obeyed it and lived it. And if the person with the most reason for doubting finally believed, then shouldn't I? Shouldn't I say that is a real story? That is the one I'm invited to. Now here's the thing. We may treat Mary, Joseph, Shepherd, and wise men as part of Christmas story. And they're the central characters in Jesus' story here. That's right and good. But we often fail to see. Do you understand what I'm saying? When we think of Christmas, we think of them as important characters in this story of Jesus. Here's what we miss. You are part of this story. That's why they put extra people all that's often. You get extras with your nativity scene. Those are you. Those are you. That's why I like seeing a nativity scene with the extras standing around who you don't know who they are. You're invited to this story. This is Him, Emmanuel, God with us. We have waves of doubt ourselves, a lot of stories in our lives that don't make sense. And we each have a sense that some information about life is missing. I know some of you do. Don't miss the meaning this year of Emmanuel. God has invited you, asking you are part of His story. Not my story, not your parents' story, not the government's story, not your own job's story, His story. Dorothy Sayers, a very, very famous author and one of the first female graduates of Oxford, was self-admittedly not a particularly beautiful woman. She wrote a series, and you'll see why I say that in a minute. She wrote a series of detective stories featuring the detective named Peter Wimsey. Now, this Peter Wimsey in the stories was a grumpy detective, not very lovable character, very dissatisfied with life. He was quite successful, but never felt whole and complete. He was this kind of darkish character. And about halfway through the series, as Dorothy Sayers is writing this, she actually starts to feel a compassion for this character that she's authoring, that she's writing about. And suddenly, a woman appears in the novels named Harriet Vane. She was not a very particularly beautiful woman, who was one of the very first women to have ever graduated from Oxford. And over time, these two characters fell in love, came together, they get to know each other, they get married, and live happily ever after. Now, people say, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? The author had such pity for this lonely character in her own book that she wrote herself into the story to love him as she felt he deserved. See, the author alone knew that the one missing link of the story to make it complete was herself. The Bible says God did that in reality. God looked at a world sinking in desperation, alone and without meaning. And He wrote Himself into the story of our lives. He knew He must write Himself into His own story for your life to be complete. And He's the author. It's His story. He wrote it. But He loves you like that, to write Himself into this story to fulfill us and bring us to restoration. You can't understand God's story and our story with God unless you accept that Jesus is the author, the Messiah, the Savior. See, God doesn't force himself on us like an author might just do in a book. He allows us to decide if we want to be adopted into his story or remained orphaned in our own desperate world. The beauty of, I think, of this, as I read through Joseph, I think the real beauty of this is that Jesus adopts the one who adopted him. Jesus adopts the one who adopted him. And to me, it's just this beautiful circle, kind of like with the Mary, the one you deliver will soon deliver you. The one Jesus adopts will adopt him. You know, Joseph awoke from the dream. He did exactly what God told him and commanded him to do. And he adopts and he raises Jesus as his son and is totally submissive in this story of God. At least four dreams happen. And you don't get a word from him. He just goes and does it. He leads his family with exactly what God says. So this one of them was for just, if you're like, what are they? Well, one of them was to flee Herod. Herod's coming, go to Egypt. One was, you're in Egypt, it's time to go home, right? We get those dreams, and he just does it without hesitation or complaint. The beauty is that Joseph adopted Jesus, ultimately, Joseph is dependent on Jesus to adopt him to make him fully righteous. That was a lot. That was a big old mouthful right there. Because Joseph, while we talk about him practicing righteousness, he wasn't perfect. He wasn't sinless. What did the angels say that Jesus is going to do? He will save his people from their sins. While Joseph is a Jew, he would have understood this as himself as well. That this Messiah would come and not only would he was a part of the problem. Joseph would have very well understood this concept. And the fact that is, the theology remains, is you are not righteous completely on your own. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says this, and this is going to apply to not only to us, but it would apply to Joseph. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. I'm not going to lie. This is complicated in the sense that righteousness has a couple of meanings, but here the point is Joseph needed Jesus' righteousness. He needed his sins forgiven. He needed the blood of his son to cover him just as much as we do today. He is the one who will usher into his Father in heaven's presence as brothers and sisters. In other words, we can't be fully righteous. The word is justified. So justified and righteous are the same word in the New Testament. A declared innocent before God. You must come to Jesus as Lord and Savior, God as King of your life. The moment you accept God's adoption of you, or you accept Jesus into your life, you kind of adopt him in this kind of sense, if you follow me. He's adopting you. He is pouring and accepting you. He's paying for you to be in the family. Doubt, I've found that not getting this is a pretty confusing thing in people's lives when they have to work on their own righteousness, but they hear that Jesus also makes them righteous. Well, you're declared righteous by Christ, but we still keep working on our becoming like Christ, which is a type of righteousness as well. Now, here's the thing. Some of us deal with doubt fairly regularly. Doubt comes from the myths that keep God out of your story. Because you're going to have God in your story to have him adopted, to be a part of his family. And some of these myths are like something like, I've got to be super strong. I've got to be the macho guy that isn't going to get shamed. You see, if Joseph had that, he wouldn't have been the right man. He wouldn't be in the story. We'd probably be talking about somebody else. The way to happiness is to stay in control. That's another myth. The way to happiness is to stay in control. Maybe our myth is, I need more stuff to feel satisfied. Our myths are often hidden, latent things in our heart we really have to look and discover. We say things like, I want justice, when what we really want is revenge. We say things like, I really want love in my life, when what we really want is lust. I want to believe in God, but what I really want is a more powerful way to live my own goals in life and aims. And those things, those myths, they make us miss who God really is. They bring doubt and go, you know what? I really don't know if I want a God like that. Don't know if I want that kind of righteousness in my life. We start thinking about our rights rather than His righteousness. The question this morning that I want to leave you with is, do you want to be a part of God's story? Are you ready for the return of Jesus Christ? Have you worked on your righteousness? Joseph apparently had not just immediately shown up to that story and knows how to respond and act. He had spent probably his life, his parents had probably helped him grow up and act righteous. And so he was prepared, the moment the king came to Israel, he was prepared to be that person to step in and raise the Son of God. Are you prepared? Is your righteousness prepared for His return? Paul says this in Acts. There shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked, the righteous going and being justified, the wicked going to hell. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before men. So while he's been justified, he's arguing that this being ready for God's return, being ready to have an experience with God today. Are you ready for that calling in your life? Because I don't know how God works in fullness, but I've noticed over the years, people who've worked on their righteousness generally are able to be more malleable to God's will. He's able to call them. He's able to fulfill them. He's able to tell them about the meaning of their life. Are you able to tell me, God has called me to this? And if God calls me to something, I am ready to be, and my life is ready and righteous, and I've worked on acting and conforming my life into the image of Jesus Christ, that when He calls me, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to have those myths out of my life, and I'm going to be open and ready for His calling in my life. Are you going to be able to say, here am I, Lord, send me? Are you going to have those myths in the back of your head and in the back of your heart going, but what I really want? Because if those are there, and you haven't dealt with them, and you haven't honestly opened up about what your heart really wants to the Lord for Him to change it, then He's waiting to change your heart so He can call you to a vocation, a meaning, a depth that you've not yet experienced. I encourage you to do that this morning. Say, Lord, search my heart. I've got lots of twisted desires, and we are a mixture of wanting to do good and also wanting to protect ourselves. We're a mixture of wanting to love others, but really also protecting my own heart in negative ways that will destroy others. Are you at that point, I encourage you to ask the Lord to show you, especially if you've been putting off a call in your own heart that you know something's there and you've just gone, nope, 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 nope. What is that wall? Let him show you this morning. And I encourage you, whatever door he's knocking on, that you would open that door and let him clean that room. Let him clean that area of your heart.